Steve Jobs was not supposed to be fired from Apple. After all, he helped create it. He was young, passionate, and obsessed with building something different. While others were thinking about computers as tools for offices, Steve imagined them as personal, creative, and powerful. He didn't just want to build products. He wanted to change how people lived. From the beginning, Steve Jobs was intense. He demanded perfection. He pushed people hard. Some loved his vision. Others feared his temper. He was brilliant but difficult. Apple grew fast, too fast. And as Apple grew, pressure grew with it. Investors wanted stability. Executives wanted structure. They wanted predictability. Steve Jobs was the opposite. He wanted control. He wanted innovation. He wanted speed. This created tension inside the company he helped build. Behind closed doors, people began questioning him. They said he was too emotional, too demanding, too risky. They said Apple needed an adult in the room. Steve didn't see it coming. One day, decisions were made without him. Meetings happened behind his back. Power slowly slipped from his hands. Then it happened. Steve Jobs was fired from Apple. From his own company. The company he named. The company he dreamed into existence. The company he sacrificed everything for. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, and that made it worse. Steve later said that being fired from Apple was the most painful experience of his life. He felt humiliated, betrayed, lost. The world watched. Some people said he deserved it. Some said Apple would finally succeed without him. Others said Steve Jobs was finished. For the first time in his life, Steve had nothing. No power, no control, no company, just rejection. For months, he felt empty. The fire inside him almost went out. He questioned himself. He wondered if everyone else had been right. But slowly, something changed. Pain turned into clarity. Steve realized something important. Being fired freed him. He was no longer trapped by expectations. He no longer had to protect a growing company. He could start again, quietly. And this time, he would do it differently. After being fired, Steve Jobs didn't disappear from the world overnight. Not as a visionary, as a mistake. Some said Apple would finally succeed without him. Others said Steve Jobs was too unstable to ever lead again. The silence after the headlines hurt more than the firing itself. For the first time, Steve had to face failure without a company to hide behind. At first, he felt ashamed. He avoided public events. He questioned his own talent. He wondered if his intensity had destroyed the one thing he loved most. But time did something important. It gave him perspective. Steve realized that being fired didn't erase his ability. It only removed his position. His creativity was still there. His obsession with great products was still alive. So he decided to start again. Quietly, Steve founded a new company called NeXT. This time, there was no hype. No massive expectations. Just a small group of people trying to build something elegant and powerful. But the world didn't believe in him anymore. They mocked NeXT. They said the computers were too expensive. They said Steve was still difficult. They said he hadn't learned anything. NeXT struggled. Sales were low. Money burned fast. Once again, Steve found himself running a company that wasn't winning. But something was different now. Steve Jobs was different. He was calmer, more patient, more reflective. Failure was teaching him lessons success never did. He learned how to listen. He learned that leadership wasn't just about vision, it was about trust. He learned that pushing people too hard could break them instead of inspiring them. At the same time, Steve made another bold move. He bought a small animation studio. Almost nobody noticed. That studio was called Pixar. At first, Pixar struggled too. Animated films were risky. Technology was expensive. Studios didn't believe in the idea. But Steve didn't quit. He supported the team. He protected creativity. He allowed artists to fail and try again. Slowly, Pixar found its voice. And then something incredible happened. Pixar released its first major film. It was a success. Then another. Then another. Suddenly, Steve Jobs was. Meanwhile, NeXT, the company everyone mocked, was quietly building something powerful. Its technology was advanced. Its software was clean and modern. People didn't realize it yet. But Apple was starting to struggle without Steve Jobs. And the company, once fired him, was about to need him again. While Steve Jobs was rebuilding himself quietly, Apple was slowly falling apart. Without Steve, the company lost its direction. Too many products, too many ideas, no clear vision. Executives argued. Engineers were confused. Customers stopped caring. Apple was no longer exciting. It was just another computer company, and not a very good one. Sales dropped. Confidence disappeared. The company that once challenged giants was now close to collapse. People who once said firing Steve Jobs was the right decision stopped talking. Because Apple was failing. Behind closed doors, Apple executives searched for solutions. They needed better software. They needed a new operating system. They needed help. That's when someone made a difficult suggestion. They should buy NeXT, the company Steve Jobs created after being fired. The irony was impossible to ignore. The same company that pushed him out now needed him back. When the deal happened, Steve Jobs returned to Apple, not as a hero, not as a king, but as an advisor. At first, many people inside Apple didn't trust him. Some feared him. Others still thought he was dangerous. They remembered his intensity. They remembered the chaos. Steve didn't rush. He watched. He listened. He studied what Apple had become. And what he saw made him sad. The company had lost its soul. So Steve Jobs did what he always did best. He simplified. He cut products. He removed confusion. He demanded focus. People complained. They said he was too harsh, too aggressive, too controlling. But Steve knew something they didn't. Apple didn't need comfort. It needed clarity. Slowly, power returned to his hands. He became interim CEO. Then CEO. This time, nobody laughed. Because Apple had no other choice. Steve Jobs was back in the company that fired him. But this time, he was different. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He was focused. He believed the best revenge was not destroying those who doubted you, but building something so great they have no choice but to follow. Steve redesigned Apple from the inside out. He focused on design. He focused on user experience. He focused on emotion. He believed technology should feel human. And then came the products. Not many, but perfect. Each product had a purpose. Each product told a story. Slowly, the world noticed. Apple wasn't dead. It was being reborn. And Steve Jobs was leading the comeback. The man who was fired from his own company was now saving it. But the greatest part of the revenge story was still ahead. Because Steve Jobs was about to change the world again. When Steve Jobs fully returned to Apple, he made one thing clear. Apple would no longer try to be everything. It would be great at a few things. The company had too many products, too many directions, and no identity. Steve cut most of them without hesitation. People inside Apple were shocked. Some were angry. Some were scared. But Steve believed simplicity was power. The first major product of the comeback was the iMac. It looked different. It felt different. It didn't look like a boring computer. People noticed. The iMac wasn't just a machine. It was a statement. It told the world that Apple was thinking differently again. Sales increased. Confidence returned. Employees felt proud again. But Steve Jobs wasn't done. He believed technology should fit into people's lives naturally. He wanted products that were simple, emotional, and beautiful. Then came the music revolution. Steve introduced a small device that could hold thousands of songs in your pocket, the iPod. At first, critics doubted it. They said it was too expensive. They said other music players already existed. They said Apple was late. Steve ignored them. He didn't care about being first. He cared about being best. The iPod changed how people listened to music. White headphones became a symbol. Apple became cool again. And then came the moment that completed the revenge. The iPhone. Steve Jobs stood on stage and introduced a product that combined a phone, music player, and internet device into one. People didn't fully understand it at first. Then they did. The iPhone changed everything. It changed how people communicate. It changed how businesses operate. It changed how the world connects. Apple didn't just recover. It dominated. The company that once fired Steve Jobs was now one of the most valuable companies in the world. And Steve Jobs was no longer seen as difficult or reckless. He was seen as a genius. But what made this comeback special was not the money. It was the message. Steve Jobs didn't return to Apple to prove people wrong with anger. He returned to prove that vision, when combined with discipline, can outlast rejection. The man who was once pushed out had rebuilt the company into something greater than it had ever been before. This was revenge through creation, not destruction. And still, Steve Jobs knew something most people didn't. Success does not erase pain. It only gives it meaning. And his story was approaching its final lesson. In the end, Steve Jobs' story was never really about Apple. It refined him. When Steve Jobs lost Apple, he didn't lose his creativity. He didn't lose his vision. He didn't lose his belief in great design and human-centered technology. He lost comfort, and that loss changed him forever. The years away from Apple taught him patience. They taught him humility. They taught him that leadership is not just about control, it's about trust, focus, and clarity. NeXT taught him discipline. Pixar taught him collaboration. Failure taught him wisdom. When Steve Jobs returned to Apple, he wasn't the same man who had been fired. He was calmer, sharper, more focused. He no longer needed to prove himself. He needed to build something meaningful. And he did. Apple became more than a company. It became a symbol of creativity, simplicity, and courage. Products didn't just work, they inspired. Technology didn't just function, it connected people emotionally. The man once labeled too difficult became the standard for innovation. The company that rejected him became one of the most valuable in history. That is the real revenge. Not destroying the people who doubted you. Not arguing with critics. Not seeking apologies. But becoming so good that doubt disappears. Steve Jobs showed the world that rejection is not the end of the story. Sometimes, it's the beginning of the best chapter. He proved that losing everything can be the moment you find your true self. That failure can sharpen vision. And that creativity, when protected and focused, can change the world. Steve Jobs didn't take revenge with anger. He took revenge with excellence. And that is why his story still matters.